This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Do you ever have a story that you just can't get out of your head?
One that you play the details of over and over with your friends?
Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan.
And this is Justice Pending,
a weekly true crime podcast where we discuss tantalizing crimes with more questions than answers.
All right, welcome everybody. My name's Raphael. I was invited here by, there's no speaker with it. It's just, I just have to speak loudly. So I was invited here by Mockingbird Books to MC this. So thank you, Mockingbird Books, for hosting this. And we're going to be here with Claire Sanamaw and Andy Kahan. They're going to be talking about the Belinda Temple, so the murder case. And then thank you, Mike, for setting up all of the equipment for the podcast and everything. And thank you, Kendall, for checking everybody in. So we'll go ahead and hand it off to them to get it started.
Thanks so much. So this is just for show?
Yeah, well,
that's kind of hilarious. All right. Here we go. Well, thank you so much for joining us for Justice Pending, the Belinda Temple case, live from Katy. This is a case that has been top of mind for people in this community for 30 years, which is hard to believe. It was January 11th, 1999, when Belinda Temple was shot and killed in her own home. Her husband, David Temple, called 911 to report a home invasion. The investigation that followed spanned years and led to multiple trials and conflicting theories of the case. It's a debate that still rages on today. I'm glad to be joined by Andy Kahan from Crime Stoppers, and I want him to tell you how he got involved with the case.
Good evening. I'm Andy Kahan, Director of Victim Services, Victim Advocacy, Crime Stoppers of Houston. I'm just here for the coffee, so I got to talk about this. All right. I've been involved in Belinda's case since January 12th, 1999, when Belinda's parents, Tom and Carol, who sadly have passed away, reached out to me about their daughter's murder, and I've been on it ever since. I serve on the board of Parents of Murdered Children and Surviving Family Members of Homicide, which is probably the only organization in the country in which someone else writes out your membership for you. No one has to be part of this. And in this particular case, I've been involved in hundreds, not thousands, but still to this date, this is the most unusual, the most bizarre, and the most hectic case that I've ever participated in, mainly because of the longevity of the case. And as I told Brian and Belinda's twin sister, Brenda, I hope no one ever has to go through what their family had to go through in 24 plus years. And that's where I began. So I've been intimately involved in this. I attended all the trials with the family. I became their spokesperson, which is why you see me on a lot of the shows that are on as well. And Brian and Belinda have become very close friends of mine, and they wanted to ask me to tell you hello from their family.
Thank you, Andy. So let's talk about the timeline in this case. This is really a devil is in the details sort of situation where we have a pretty tight timeline when the murder occurred, and we have a series of events that really start to paint a picture of what was happening in the Temple family. So let's go back to January 11th, 1999. Belinda Temple is 8 months pregnant. They already have a 3-year-old son, Evan, together. But on this particular morning, Evan was actually not feeling too well. And so while Belinda, who was a special education teacher at Katy High School, go Tigers, my alma mater, and David was a assistant football coach at A-Leaf Hastings. So they were both working in education, and they had a sick kid. So everybody knows the juggle when you have a sick kid. You're trying to figure out who's going to stay home and who's going to go to work, right? Well, in this case, with Belinda being 8 months pregnant, she was trying to stack up that PTO, right? She didn't want to miss time now when she knew she was going to be having the baby. And so she had spoken to David about being the one to go be with their son if he were to be too sick at daycare and need someone to come home. But whenever the daycare calls, you know, who do they call? They always call the mom, right? They call the mom. And so Belinda's trying to get a hold of David. And at this time, she's not able to get a hold of him. And she's frustrated because they'd already known that their son wasn't feeling well. They'd kind of discussed a plan. And so why couldn't she reach him? What was David doing? This is something we'll circle back to. But just know that for many hours, she's not able to reach her husband. And so Belinda actually has to leave school and picks up her son and waits to get in touch with David, who finally does get in touch and comes home and allows Belinda to go back to Katy High School and finish out the day. So that leads us to about 3:30 p.m., the end of an educator's day, right? And so she's leaving Katy High School and stops by her in-laws, the Temples, to pick up some homemade soup for the family, a kind gesture. But it also gives us a key point in the timeline because we know that she would have left their house around 3:45, 4 o'clock is generous, right? You have a sick kid at home. You're 8 months pregnant. You're not going to sit around and talk for half an hour with the in-laws. You're going to get the soup and head on home, right? So at this point, Belinda arrives back home, and this is where we have to take David Temple's word for it, at least initially, because he's the only adult witness to what happens next. So at this point, David says that Belinda was tired and wanted to take a nap, and that he left the house with Evan to go run some errands. Do you want to talk about that, Andy?
So David, being the magnanimous man, decides he's going to take sick Evan, put him in the car. I don't even believe at that time there was a car seat in the car, but that's okay. So David drives all around Katy area and decides he's going to take him to a park like 8 miles away, even though there's a park right by their neighborhood. But no, we're going to go 8 miles with a sick kid, goes there. Then he goes to several stores that all of you will recognize, Brookshire Brothers. And he walks in a Home Depot. There's a big picture of him walking in a Home Depot with Evan. And then pretty soon walks back. Who goes in the Home Depot for like less than 5 minutes? Only one person that I know of, but he wanted to make sure that he got visibly seen there. So he's doing all this with a sick kid before he finally ends up coming home. But he was actually seen by someone that actually saw him taking a route home. And that's where things get really squirrely.
Yes, they do. So it's not until an hour after that first surveillance image of David and his son, Evan, that they make it back home. So you have this hour-long, maybe hour-and-a-half-long period of running errands with a sick kid in, like, the witching hour, right? Like, kids around 4 or 5 o'clock, it's not really the time for activities and excursions, right? It's a time to be winding down at home. And we have this very unusual activity of going on these multiple errands. And it allows David to have these timestamps in his, what would eventually become his alibi, pinpointing him at these different locations. And by the time they get home, which is about 5:30, they arrive home. And as David would say, he notices that something is wrong at the house. There's a door where the glass has been broken out. He suspects, he says, a home invasion. And so he takes his son to the neighbors tells the neighbors, our home's been broken into and you need to call 911. And so the first 911 call is actually from the neighbors. And then about 5 minutes later at 5:35 p.m., David Temple himself calls 911 and says that he's found his wife, his pregnant wife, dead, shot in the head in their closet. And it is a horrific scene. There is, of course, the first responders say, can you try CPR? Can you find a pulse? And he says, she's gone. She's dead. There is no pulse. And it is just really a heartbreaking scene as you see this mother and child that are completely wasted away here, senselessly. This is a suburban street in Katy, Texas, at, the time that most people are coming home from work and school. This is not a typical time for a burglary. You're talking about home invasions. Hey, they happen, right? They do happen. But when do they happen? The middle of the night, right? You're going to talk about 2, 3, 4 a.m., maybe, 5 a.m. But even then, people are starting to get up and go to work. So the idea that it would be this late, I'd love for Andy to talk about that.
All right, so let's be real. Not even the dumbest burglar in the world is going to break into a home in the middle of a day after 3 p.m. during a work week when kids are coming home from school. That's number one fallacy. Number two, of course, the broken door. And we'll get into some of the evidence involving that. So we took a look, and I said, well, I wonder how many burglaries occurred in that neighborhood, let's say that year, the year before, 2 years before. And I got a very consistent answer, a big fat 0. No burglaries had occurred. So that sends up major red flags for the officers that came to the scene.
All right, so let's talk about the evidence. This is a complicated crime scene. We've alluded to the fact that there was a broken window. So it's the back door that actually has a window busted out. The glass is broken. There's also signs of distress inside the house. Television has been flipped over off of its TV stand. It's still plugged in, which is interesting. Drawers are open. Things have been rifled through. It definitely looks like, I don't know, maybe like some wild raccoons got into the house. Things are turned upside down, but interestingly enough, nothing's missing. When they start to do an inventory, they realize all of Belinda's jewelry's there, her wallet's there, her purse is there, the electronics are there. So if this was a home invasion robbery, what did they take?
You know what they took? They took Belinda and her unborn child's life. That's what they took. I mean, again, if you're going to stage a burglary, at least have the pretense to even take something. His jewelry's right there. Other jewelry's right there. Her stuff is right there. You don't even take that. And then, of course, when investigators were looking at the glass, when it was shattered from the inward as opposed to the outward, that was another huge red flag as well. And then, you know what the big one was? Anybody ever heard of Shaka? Nope. Who knows what Shaka is? The dog. Shaka was a terror. Shaka ruled that yard. You didn't go past the Temple house without Shaka barking up a storm and everybody knowing that you were near the Temple house. You can't get in the house with Shaka around. When the deputies arrived at the crime scene, they almost had to put the dog down because they couldn't get in. Yet David Temple's telling investigators that somehow burglars managed to get past Shaka the dog, but the deputies couldn't.
The dog continues to be a question that the defense doesn't have a good answer for. They've tried to say that David put the dog in the garage. They've tried to invent reasons why this dog wouldn't be barking for a stranger, but it really defies logic for anyone that knew this dog. And it has really created a big problem for David Temple's theory of the case, which is a stranger broke in and killed his pregnant wife, right? So let's talk about the murder weapon. We have, based on ballistics, a 12-gauge shotgun, pretty common hunting weapon, and buckshot ammunition. So this is not something, if you're robbing houses, that you would typically bring with you, is it, Andy?
All right. How many burglars, and I know a lot, how many burglars go around with a shotgun? Again, you got to be ridiculous to think you're going to break into a home the middle of the day walking around with a shotgun. It just doesn't happen. And again, we said, you know what? Let's, for grins, take a look at the weapons used in break-ins. Guess what weapon we didn't ever find? A shotgun. Again, another big fat 0. So strike 1 on the dumb burglar aspect, strike 2 on the shotgun.
So no one has to guess Andy's opinion on this case. So we have this gun that has disappeared, right? There are 2 shotguns, 2 guns found at the Temple home, but neither of them match ballistically with the murder weapon. So we are left wondering, where could this gun be? And again, we go back to David Temple's movements on the day of the murder. And we have this really interesting map that he took to go not only to run these errands, to take his sick son to play in a park. We all know how sick kids love to play in the park. But there's unaccounted time for. And there is this witness that Andy mentioned that sees David Temple, recognizes him because of his career playing football, Katy High School, known as the Temple of Doom. A little double meaning might be applicable here. And then coaching, right, at a local high school. So he's recognizable and he's noticed. And where he's seen, actually, there are rice fields. And it has been hypothesized that the amount of time that he was gone and the locations that he visited, there's about a 15, 20-minute discrepancy from how long it would have really taken him to just go from place to place, even accounting for visiting them for a period of time. Because we have, of course, the entrance and the exits with the video surveillance. We know how long he was in the stores. But the idea that he could have dumped this murder weapon while he's out driving, it's definitely another piece of the puzzle that we wish we had the clear picture, but we start to see a very logical explanation for why no one's ever been able to find that shotgun. What do you think about the probability of it being discarded, Andy?
190 bazillion% on that. It's that's just the reality of it. He was very calm, even in the 911 call. If you listen to it, which I've listened to it, he's very calm. He's not, think about yourself in a situation like that. You'd probably be a little bit hysterical, yelling, crying or something. He was very methodical. His whole demeanor was calm, like it was, well, it happened. She's gone. And that's the end of it. And when he was questioned, by deputies, he immediately clamored up, "I want a lawyer." That says something. Your pregnant wife was just murdered, an unborn child murdered, and all you're talking about is, "I want my lawyer."
So let's also talk about one other piece of, I guess you would call it circumstantial evidence, where we have questions about when Belinda Temple died. We have this period of time, 3:45, 4 o'clock to 5:30. before the 911 call. And we don't know, the medical examiner, it's not like CSI, y'all. They can't tell you down to the minute when someone was shot. They can give you a window. They can look at an estimate. But an hour and a half, it's too tight of a timeline for them to say definitively when she was shot. So what do good investigators do? They pound the pavement. They start knocking on doors. They talk to neighbors. And so there are neighbors who are just behind the Temple's house, and they had some kids home from school, after school, watching a movie. And these kids said they remembered hearing what they thought might be a gunshot, a loud noise that they remembered hearing. And so everyone's trying to figure out, well, kids aren't looking at the clock. They don't know what time it was. So they try to go back and play the movie and say, when did you hear the gunshot? What scene was it on? And then they take, the time code of the movie and place it up against when we know Belinda Temple got home. And, it's not an exact science. It's not a mathematical equation. It's an estimate. But based on when they hear this noise and the scene that's playing and all those other factors, they believe that the noise they heard went off about 4:30 p.m. So that's very good news for David Temple. Do you remember why? He's on video surveillance at 4:32 at Home Depot. So if that's really the time that the gunshot went off, if you could actually say that for certain, then he would have an airtight alibi. So what are your thoughts on that, Andy?
Do I have to say anything? Can I just smile? Yeah, so again, you're basing it on young kids. And so, obviously the defense was really zeroing in on that time frame, and I would too if I was a part of that defense team on that. But again, there was no conclusive time that could ever be stated factually on that. And then, of course, our perspective was that, I'll just come out and say it, he murdered Belinda before he went on his little Mary errand trip as well. And I think everybody eventually became more comfortable with that theory than with that little tiny window that he was trying to establish an alibi for.
So we've talked about David lawyering up pretty early in the process, but we haven't talked about who he got as his defense attorney. And this is a legal legend. It was
No, actually first.
First, he didn't have Dick DeGuerin?
No, at first he had some guy with the appropriate name, Paul Looney, who was actually defended was actually Timothy McVeigh's original attorney. And you saw how that went. So, yeah, Paul Looney was his original attorney, and basically Temple basically said, I'm not talking anymore. You would think someone would want to talk because you would think they'd want to know who the heck murdered your wife. Right? Something. But that didn't happen. Then eventually he got the, quote, living legend Dick DeGuerin to represent them, and that became one of the all-time you-know-what contests.
So we had Dick DeGuerin for the defense at trial, and we also had Kelly Siegler as the prosecutor of cold justice fame. Not at that time, but later on. And so you have two really big, heavy hitters in the courtroom for this case, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's talk about suspects. Of course, you have to start with the person closest to the victim. And in this case, that's David Temple. We have talked about how he had the time to do this. He had access to the house with no other witnesses other than a 3-year-old that can very easily, at that age, be distracted, have things explained to them. That's a very young age to witness anything.
He was actually asleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have, of course, David Temple, and we have to talk about the fact that the number one risk to pregnant women is actually their partners. That is the sad but true statistically speaking, the most likely person to harm a pregnant woman is the father of the child, which no one wants to believe. But unfortunately, we not only have the statistics there, but to make matters worse, David was having an affair. So in the weeks leading up to his wife's murder, David had been sneaking around and seeing another woman named Heather Scott, who also worked at A-Leaf Hastings. And this plays into this period of time, these hours on January 11th, when Belinda cannot get a hold of her husband at work. And whenever hindsight is 20/20, but whenever you start putting the pieces of this puzzle together, it really starts to create a picture of motive. People kill for love and money, and this case certainly would fit into that mold. And it was actually proven later that when David said he was going on a New Year's hunting trip, New Year's Eve hunting trip, he was in fact with his mistress, Heather. And so this is while his wife is 8 months pregnant, on New Year's, just 2 weeks before she would be murdered. He's saying he's hunting.
He was hunting. He was hunting Heather.
Yeah. It's a really disturbing picture that's being painted. And not only that, you have the fact that Belinda is murdered with a hunting weapon and with hunting ammunition, buckshot, right? Intended for animals. So it's almost like, to me, it's almost like an admission that he was in this hunting mindset. He was hunting for a new life, right? And he believed that he was going to get away with it. And so the idea that we know he's gone on this trip with his mistress, they've been sneaking around, he's not reachable the morning of January 11th, then he comes home, right? It's not that far of a leap to imagine that there might have been some type of argument, some type of confrontation that escalated. And when Belinda is found shot, it's difficult to talk about, but she was actually on her knees in the closet of the master bedroom. And that really is such a haunting picture. And not only that, she was still wearing her shoes and she was still wearing her clothes from school that day. So the idea that she was taking a nap, relaxing, and a burglar came into the house and shot her, it doesn't really match the evidence, does it, Andy?
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I've not been in this position, but if you're 8 months pregnant, you're taking your shoes off, right? Especially if you're going upstairs. And that didn't happen, of course, in this case. So, and I'll read this to you. During Belinda's twin sister, Brenda, told me several things that Belinda was confiding in Brenda about things that were going on between her and David. David was not exactly happy about Aaron coming into the world. He didn't want it. She kept asking, you've got to build the playroom. He wouldn't do it. He really did not want his child, 8-month-old daughter, to come into the world. And this is what Belinda was telling her twin sister, her best friend, Brenda, about that. So there's little things like that. Then during the funeral, and I'll just read this to you because I can't say it any better. At the funeral, someone asked him at the funeral, well, don't you want to know who killed your wife? David Temple responded, and this is a direct quote, would it matter? She's dead. She's not coming back. Who in their right mind would actually say that? I was floored when that was also in the record.
So, because this is a podcast and we talk about all possibilities and we go down every road, there is another theory to this case, one that doesn't involve David Temple pulling the trigger. I'm talking about the neighbor Riley Joe Sanders. Has anyone heard this name before? There might be some people out here who think that this is a viable suspect, and I think it's worth discussing for the sake of we have to go down every road, right? You can't know what the right one is until you've gone down the wrong ones. And so at the time of the murder, let's talk about who Riley Joe Sanders was. He was a student at Katy High School, and he'd actually had some run-ins with Belinda Temple. So in the past, she had caught him skipping class and had called his parents, and he'd gotten in trouble, and this was not a friendly relationship that they had. This was not a teacher that Riley Joe Sanders was a big fan of, right? And so what was Riley Joe Sanders doing the afternoon of the murder? We'd all like to know, right? Well, a big reason why he ended up becoming a suspect in this case is because he lied about what he was doing. He said, I was at school. I was at school the whole day, and I was, with my friends after school. Well, it turns out he was actually skipping school that day. He had not stayed at school the whole day. And while he was with friends, he was also smoking pot. So there starts to be some serious questioning of Riley, and they want to know, what kind of weapons does he have? Well, it's Katy, Texas, y'all. He's got some 12-gauge shotguns. They're in the family, and at that time, it's actually unaccounted for where his shotgun is. So it really feeds into this theory that a disgruntled youth who's not the sharpest knife in the drawer, not a criminal mastermind, possibly was angered at this teacher and did something really irrational, did something really impulsive, and committed this murder. So if you're David Temple and you're David Temple's defense team, you're going to cling to this with everything that you have, because there's nothing better than an alternate suspect when you're trying to put forth a claim of innocence. Andy, how do you feel about the Riley Joe Sanders theory?
I've talked multiple times to Riley as an adult, and my heart goes out to him because he was so unfairly tainted. But I understand, and trust me, the investigators vigorously vetted him. Not once, not twice, but multiple times before they were able to rule him out. So he underwent a lot of intensive scrutiny by seasoned professionals. And most 16-year-olds, if they did something, are going to crack. And he never did. And he's, for the rest of his life and still to this day, he will bear the brunt of being named as a suspect in this case. Yes, he had run in, and Belinda went to Riley's parents. Riley's parents grounded him as a result of him doing stuff. But Riley Joe Sanders eventually was cleared of all wrongdoing.
So let's talk about when David Temple's first arrested. So it doesn't happen right away. There's actually years that go by because there is no physical evidence, right? There's no murder weapon. There's not blood on David Temple. There's not fingerprints. There's not a way to put him on the trigger. So it's 2004. So this happened in 1999. It takes 2004 for the FBI crime lab to get a gunshot residue match from Belinda's clothing at the time of the murder and David's clothing at the time of the murder. And he's finally arrested. It's like he thinks it's a traffic stop. And they end up taking him in for the murder in 2004. So at this time, he'd actually gone ahead and married his mistress, Heather. So he was living this completely different life that was upended by the arrest. And because arrests and the wheels of justice, it spins slowly. It's not something that happens fast. So it's not till 2007 that David Temple goes on trial for his wife's murder for the first time. And the defense really goes after this gunshot residue evidence. They say that it's junk science. They had all sorts of theories for how it ended up on David's clothing. They even pulled up the fact that the FBI crime lab shared a ventilation system with a shooting range, and the idea that these gunshot residue particles magically floated through the air and landed on David's clothing that match Brenda's. I mean, it all sounds pretty far-fetched, right, Andy?
Let me tell you about the true nature of David Temple. So, Belinda's parents, Tom and Carol, wanted to see their grandson, Evan. You know, Evan was 3, now 4, now 5. David Temple refused every single time they asked to meet with him. He did allow them to meet with Evan twice under supervision. They couldn't be alone with him. Now think about that. You wouldn't let grandparents of your wife that was murdered spend time with their grandchild. That just smacks of his own ego with that. It did take years for him to finally get charged, and then he's out on bond, and then we got to wait for trial. It took, let me go back to Heather. So January 11th, 1999, Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1999. Guess who had a dozen bouquet of roses sent? Guess. Heather got from David a little over 1 month after her death. And then 2 years later, they end up getting married. And eventually, they actually Heather legally adopted and raised Evan as well. But for Belinda's family, they were totally shut out. And, you know, and they don't really have of means. I'm not saying, you know, and they didn't have any recourse to fight this in court. And the Temple family David's family thought they were kings and queens in the Katy area. They ruled. Belinda's family was not so affectionately called by them as trailer trash more than multiple times. That's what you're dealing with right here. So we finally get to trial, but the first grand jury rejected. They didn't come back with an indictment. And the only reason they came back the second time was because they put Kelly Siegler on the case. And Kelly knows what she's doing. And so Kelly had fresh eyes, took a look at the case, and they presented it to another grand jury. And they had a little bit more evidence that time. So on the second try is when the grand jury came back and indicted him for murder.
This case has had a long and winding road in the legal system, and the first trial in 2007 ends in a conviction for David Temple for murder, and he's sentenced to life in prison. The tight timeline, the allegations of crime scene staging, and of course, the affair likely played a role in the jury's decision here. But the defense wasn't giving up, and they filed an appeal that centered around Riley Joe Sanders and the fact that not all the evidence surrounding him and pertaining to his activities had been turned over to the defense. So it is one of those kind of legal maneuvers that rarely works, but in this case, actually had David Temple's conviction overturned in 2016.
So in the first trial, which lasted close to a month, and I was, like I said, I was at the trial every day. I actually got more exercise because Dick DeGuerin would object. We'd have to stand up because they'd have to remove the jury. It was like being a human pogo stick, up and down, up and down. It was the battle of the Titans, which is how I described the matchup between DeGuerin and Siegler. You had two alphas going at it. So keep in mind, this trial lasted almost a month. You know how long the jury was out before they came back with a verdict? 4 hours. That was it. Jury saw right through it. And they nailed him. I remember when they came back with a verdict, I remember everybody was looking at him, and he was just like, oh, my God, they came back. He actually took the stand. Most criminal defendants charged with murder never take the stand. And I know Siegler was licking her chops. It was like a shark up there just dancing around him because again, this is the, quote, Temple of Doom, big-time football star. He's not used to being bossed around by little Kelly Siegler, who's 5'4". That didn't set too well with David, and he didn't really know how to act or respond with the type of grilling that Kelly was giving him. And it was a definite mismatch. That was a huge mistake by the defense, was putting him on the stand because he got TK'd.
It's always fascinating to me when a suspect thinks they can outsmart the investigators, the prosecutors, the jury, and they take the stand whenever they have the right to remain silent. It's such an important right, but I'm so glad that the guilty people many times don't think that they'll be caught, and it's their own undoing by going on the stand, and it is a extreme act of hubris to think that they can go up there and answer for their crimes and actually get away with it. And it's always a fascinating day in court. There's a lot of boring days in court, but the day that the defendant takes the stand is not one of the boring ones for sure. So we have this whole other trial that goes down. It doesn't happen until 2019, and in that interim, David Temple actually gets out of prison and is out on bond, which is just remarkable.
I'm going to go back. There's one thing I do want to go back on the original 1999 murder. I wasn't working at Crime Stoppers then, but I was affiliated with them in my capacity. We put out a billboard, Crime Stoppers did, right on the Katy freeway, right by, I believe it was, wherever the Grand Parkway wasn't, but whatever it is right now. We had a billboard, who killed, $10,000 reward. We had a press conference. I was there with Belinda's family. You know who wasn't there? Nobody from the Temple family. I'm going, why aren't they here trying to find out who killed their daughter-in-law? They weren't there, period. But David did get out on bond, and he actually, when he got out, he was like, he got out and he started yelling at the cameras, I'm going to find out who did me wrong. And his attorney's telling him to don't say anymore. And you saw it right there. I'm going to find out who unjustly, kept me in prison, things of that nature. Nothing about Belinda again.
So David Temple got yet another day in court, another trial in 2019. This time, his second wife, Heather Scott, was no longer by his side. She actually filed for divorce. Yeah, it was a bombshell.
It was.
And many people thought that maybe new information would come out. Now that, you have spousal privilege, you don't have to testify against your spouse. You can't be compelled to do that. But they were no longer married. But unfortunately, there wasn't any revelation from Heather Scott about any type of pillow talk, confession.
You know what the revelation was when she testified? That her own testimony said, David and I never discussed the murder of Belinda during our marriage. Kid, come on. Really? It was like pulling teeth out of her on the stand. You want to talk about someone that was reluctantly being up there? It definitely showed. I actually got tipped off before it was released that divorce. We confirmed it, and then it was like a bomb exploded when that happened as well. So, but again, I was at that trial every single day with Belinda's family. Tom was still alive at that time. Carol, unfortunately, had passed away. And every single day that we were there, It was just amazing. And this time he has a new attorney, Stan Schneider, okay, another very well-known, attorney that's very well respected. And at this time, though, he gets a court-appointed attorney because David claims he's indigent. And I guess the whole Temple family law, all of a sudden, they couldn't fork it up. So they actually appointed Stan Schneider as a court-appointed attorney during the trial.
So round two, even with all this new evidence allowed in against alternate suspect Riley Joe Sanders, David was once again convicted and ultimately sentenced to life in prison. There's a little plot twist in that they initially say, we're going to have a hung jury. We can't decide his punishment. We're going to have a whole separate trial for sentencing. But all in all, he was ultimately given the same punishment again. So despite all of the machinations, the result was the same.
The jury quickly convicted him the second time. And they were out days on the punishment phase. And we're like, I can't believe this. They finally came back and said, we're hung. We can't come back with a verdict. And so they had to do a mistrial, not on the guilt and innocence, but on the punishment. I've not seen that before. 2 jurors reached out to me that evening. They called me. And they wanted me please let Belinda's family know how sorry we were. And they kind of gave me a blow-by-blow what was happening in the jury room, which you don't often hear. They said it was 10 for life. You had 2 people who, for reasons unbeknown, one of them wanted probation, which he was actually eligible for at that time, because at that time you could actually get probation for murder. I ended up changing that. So if you want to commit murder and you thought you were going to get probation, you can blame me for that. You can't get probation anymore for that. They actually wanted probation, and the other one wanted 17 years. And they refused to talk. One of them, actually, we found out, had relatives in prison. And for whatever reason, that was not discovered at the time that she was put on the jury. But they were heartbroken that they couldn't give them the verdict that 10 of them wanted. So now you've got 2 juries who have now found David Temple guilty of murder. 22 out of 24 jurors wanted life in prison. So now he's a 2-time convicted murderer, and we're still waiting sentencing. So they put a bond of $1 million on him. And he couldn't make the bond. And I was stating, if he does make bond, we're going to ask that his court-appointed attorney, Stan Schneider, be removed, because if you can make $1 million bond, we, the taxpayers, shouldn't be paying for your attorney. So he remained in custody, awaiting not guilt or innocent trial, but waiting sentencing for punishment.
And so he was finally fully punished with life in prison once again. And he continued to try to appeal everything that he could on all the legal grounds that he could, all the way up until 2025, when the Court of Appeals upheld the conviction and the life sentence. So have we heard the last from David Temple, Andy?
I'm going to go back to the trial, because I'm going to tell you one of the saddest things that I saw was when Evan walked into the courtroom. Evan's now a young man. He graduated from Texas A&M. By all accounts, he's very well adjusted, solid person. When he walked into the courtroom, I'm sitting with Brian and Brenda. And Brian turns around and he says to me, "That's the first time I've seen Evan in over 20 years. And he said, he's got Belinda's eyes. That was one of the saddest things. And they actually put Evan on the stand in the punishment phase. Evan, and, I'm not saying anything negative against him. He fully believes in his father's innocence, and I'm not going to take that away from him. And he fully believed that he had two mothers, the mother that birthed him, and as he says, the mother that raised him, Heather, on that as well. And I do believe in the second trial, the jury was very sympathetic towards Evan, and maybe that might have played a role into why they couldn't come up with the sentencing on the life. But he did testify again on the third sentencing phase. Not only that, but in the punishment phase of the trial, David Temple brought in 7 character witnesses from prison. At this time, he's now a ordained prison minister. Yes, he is a minister in TDCJ. And I'm going, if you're a minister, don't you got to admit what you did? How can you administer to other people if you're not even admitting you killed your wife? He had one person up there, we're looking him up, I'm pointing out to the media, he's a convicted sex offender out on parole. And I'm going, this was his character witnesses. You can't script that. And luckily the jury came back, saw through it, because keep in mind, the jury had an enormous responsibility because the punishment range was anywhere from from probation all the way up to life in prison. That's a long latitude. And to get 12 people to agree, so now you have 34 out of 36 jurors who agreed in giving him a life sentence. David Temple is parole eligible in the year 2040. Now, I already said I'm planning on being there because our perspective is you don't deserve to ever breathe free air again. And we're going to make damn sure that you don't do that. And you can go on and continue to pretend you're some sort of prison minister or whatever. Have a nice life behind bars.
It's really the ultimate grift, the ones who are convicted of these crimes and then they want to play the victim. The idea that David Temple is a victim here is a pretty big farce, but I'm sure he's got people behind bars believing it. So thank you so much. I'd love to take your questions. Raphael's going to come around, and if you have a question, he's going to hand you the mic and let you take a question.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. Back in 1999, did they test for fingerprints, like on the broken door, pushing over the TV? Was any of that done back then? I don't know, if they did that kind of stuff back then, but wouldn't it show someone's fingerprints unless they wore gloves? But
Right. They absolutely tested for fingerprints. A lot of the problems that you have with areas like doorknobs and TVs, high touch areas. And so if they're not a clean area with a pristine fingerprint, they've been touched hundreds or thousands of times before someone has wiped it clean. And so it's very difficult to get a clean fingerprint from a high touch area like a doorknob or a TV. And of course, David Temple lived there. So his fingerprints being there wouldn't have even been suspicious.
But it would rule out.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the second part of the question is, Heather, when you said that he got divorced and she still didn't want to say anything, did they rule out that she could have been an accomplice in this whole thing?
They confiscated all the emails back and forth between them since they were both at the same school. And it didn't appear that she was aware. I mean, obviously she was aware that Belinda was murdered, and, you're going to believe what David Temple said. I just find it hard to believe that you never talked about it in whatever years, and especially because David's in prison for roughly 8 or 9 years, and you're raising Evan at the time.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So this seems to be a heinous crime, and if she was on her knees 8 months pregnant and shot in the head, that's an execution style murder. So why was the death penalty not put on him, just life in prison?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the death penalty triggers so many different protocols, including multiple mandatory appeals. A lot of times, prosecution is reluctant to use a death penalty case, especially in a domestic dispute, because you have the victim's family and the defendant's family sharing people. And so the idea that you would execute someone else in this family starts to kind of compound the trauma. But Andy, do you have anything else to add on this particular case?
No, I'm just kidding. Actually, he didn't meet the criteria for death penalty. Death penalty in that particular case would have involved the murder of two people. And at that time, an unborn child wasn't considered by statute to be an actual person. And so because there was no other offense committed, so in other words, if I go and shoot and kill you right now, I'm not eligible for the death penalty, okay? But if I rob you, kidnap, or sexually assault you and kill you because there's another crime attached besides the murder, then I'm eligible. And that didn't happen in David Temple's case.
That does not make sense.
Well, criminal justice and logic are oxymoronic terms that often have a difficult times making sense. So that's why he was not eligible.
It's so interesting because you talk about like the Lacey Peterson case, which happened in 2002, and there was an unborn child in that case. Lacey was also pregnant, and they were able to charge him with the murder of both in that case. So that's really interesting. I didn't realize at the time the law was different, and just a few years later it had changed. Maybe they should call that the Temple law, right? That's pretty unbelievable that they wouldn't be able to charge him with two murders at that time, and the concurrent, right, that would make it eligible for the death penalty. And his theory of the case is that there was a home invasion and a murder, right? But I guess you can't rob your own house. So that's very convoluted. That's really interesting, the intricacies there.
Besides, the obvious victim, Belinda, and her unborn child, you know who else is a victim of David Temple?
Evan.
Not just Evan, but Riley Joe Sanders.
Yeah.
If you Google his name, the first thing you see is David Temple. And he's had to live with that. He's a fine young man these days. He lives in Arkansas. He's married, has children. But think about it. David Temple was willing to have a 16-year-old high school student go to prison for life. That's how sadistic and insidious and diabolical David Temple is. He was willing to have a 16-year-old take the rap.
And then second question, does Evan have a relationship with his aunt, his mom's twin sister?
Unfortunately, no. We spent a lot of time in the courtroom, and unfortunately, he would just walk by and wouldn't say anything, And we're not, obviously, you can't push that. I hope one day he comes to the realization, and I hope one day that comes, and I hope one day that he does reach out to Brian Lucas and Brenda, because, they deserve to have some sort of relationship with him. But it's another fracture of the arm of David Temple that had so many different victims. And he also victimized his own family. I don't, much as a lot of people don't like the Temple family, and me too, because they didn't like me being in the courtroom, and they made no bones about it. Look what he did to that family. pretty much bankrupt them under the delusion of coming up with this 16-year-old, so forth. So he ruined their family, his family as well.
Did Belinda have a life insurance policy that David tried to collect on or anything after her murder?
Life insurance policy was the question. So my assumption would be, just as an employee of Katy High School, that she probably did have a life insurance policy. I don't think that it would be paid out whenever the case is open and active. Mm-hmm. I have seen cases where spouses are able to get the life insurance payout if they've been ruled out as a suspect and it's considered a cold case and there's extenuating circumstances. But as far as I know, that didn't apply here. Andy, do you have any insight into the life insurance?
To my knowledge, the life insurance was never an issue and was never even brought up or discussed.
I was just thinking motive.
Yeah, definitely a motive in terms of if you get a divorce, you have to split all your assets. So even if you don't get a life insurance policy, you still don't have to give 50% of the house and the car and share custody of a child or anything like that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if this is necessarily specific to the Belinda Temple case as much as it is to your roles in the respective cases. How much do you think your relationships with the individuals in this case, or in these cases in general, impacts objectivity?
Yeah, great question about objectivity.
I'd love to hear a lawyer, by the way. Please.
Facts matter. I'm sorry, when you look at everything in this case, trust me, the victim's family has much to make sure. They want to make sure that person who's convicted is the actual perpetrator. When I see people that get exonerated and I'm going, who else loses besides obviously the person that was deprived of their liberty? The victim's family, because they were under the belief that person was the person that committed the murder on their family member. They wanted to make sure that is the person. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. No one else had a motive. No one else had the means. No one else had the gumption to do what they did by murdering Belinda. So I don't think there's any ifs, ands, or buts by anybody with a reasonable mind when they look at all. And obviously, this case, you didn't have the proverbial smoking gun but what you did was you had a lot of pieces of a puzzle, and this was circumstantial. But when you put those puzzle pieces together, the only logical conclusion anybody can come up with, and keep in mind, 3 juries had no ifs, ands, or buts about convicting him, that David Temple murdered his wife.
Any other questions? Thank you so much. Oh, we got a couple more. All right. We got someone back there.
Hi, yes. You had mentioned that he had gone hunting shortly before before January 11th? And so I'm thinking, okay, he's probably hunting for deer. In Texas, we know all of our seasons by, when we go hunting. So he's probably deer hunting. Did he bring like a buckshot shotgun to the deer camp? Did he go hunting with other people? Is that one of the guns of one of their, like a friend? Who's that gun registered to? I mean, it could have been his dad's or something. I get that. But someone in his circle must have had access to that gun that went missing.
So the hunting trip was a lie. He didn't actually go hunting. He was with his girlfriend, his mistress at the time. So the idea that he said he was hunting, but he wasn't actually hunting, is interesting, right? And he had multiple guns in the house, and the idea that he says that all of his guns are accounted for, those guns in the closet, right? Those two guns are his only guns, but these other there's just a lot of questions about where he went during that hour and a half, and the fact that the guns in the closet were proven not to be the murder weapons, and yet we still have a very similar gun that was used. So, yeah, it's hard to keep track of all the shotguns in Katy, Texas, I gotta tell you.
So let me ask you guys this. So what questions would you want me to ask David Temple? Because I'll fire him off a letter, or I might even go pay him a visit. What do you want to know from him? I'll just tell him, hey, we were here tonight. We were talking about you and, giving you a lot of love.
I used to have a P.O. box for all the letters I would write to prison because I didn't want, I think they're probably never going to get out, but just in case, right? But it was when I stopped working at 48 Hours, I was able to close that P.O. box, and it's a nice peace of mind right there. But Andy will he'll write the letter, huh? Well, if we have maybe time for one more question, if there's another question. All right. Oh, hold on just one sec.
Did either of you ever interview him face to face?
I did not.
And what would you ask
Nope,
him?
but I did see him in the restroom at the courthouse.
Did he wash his hands?
And he was a piece of crap still?
It's a weird feeling when you're in there.
He was still a piece of crap?
Yes.
Okay.
Pardon the pun, yes.
Who are we going to do the next podcast on?
Oh, man. Who are we going to do the next
We want
podcast
you
on?
to come
I'm
back.
doing Darlie Routier. Yes, this is a case out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this is a woman who's accused of killing her own children. Really horrific. She maintains her innocence as well. So I will be talking about that case next in Denton on, I want to say, May 28th. I think that's right. I've tried to have it all the tip of my tongue. But thank you so much for coming. It was a really great conversation. I appreciate you.
Justice Pending is recorded in Dallas, Texas for Rebel Studios. It's hosted by me, Claire Sanama, and Susan Passoni. Our theme music is Bending Truth, licensed at premiumbeat.com. We appreciate all listener feedback. Leave a review wherever you're listening right now, and we might read it on the air. Thanks for joining us.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.